We are ready to go live now.
Thank you so much. I'm Dr. Lisa Cameron, Member of Parliament for East Kilbride, Straven and Les Mahago, and Chair of the Disability All-Party Parliamentary Group in Parliament. I'm also the Treasurer of the Freedom of Religious Belief All-Party Parliamentary Group, and it's absolutely fabulous to be here with you this morning for what will be an excellent session where we will look at the intersectionality of disability, disability rights and human rights, and freedom of religious belief. I'll be co-hosting this session today with an excellent cross-party colleague who's chair of the All-Party Group for International Freedom of Religion or Belief, Mr. Jim Shannon MP. So I'm looking forward to this session tremendously today. We have a wonderful panel of speakers who will be presenting the research that they're undertaking and the work in the field that they undertake from the front line. First of all, we will have Bridget Rowerder, Research Officer from the Institute of Development Studies and co-author of Freedom of Religious Belief and People with Disabilities Evidence from India, who will co-host the first discussion with Stephen Thompson, postdoctoral research fellow, co-author of the book Freedom of Religious Belief and People with Disabilities Evidence from India. So we'll have Bridget and Stephen firstly. This will be followed by another speaker who is Dilmurad Yusupov, PhD candidate from the Institute of Development Studies at the University of Sussex, who will be speaking about the intersectionality of disability, ethnicity and religious inequalities in the post-Soviet Uzbekistan. So another really interesting and topical speech and presentation from Dilmurad. And then we will hear from Professor Maris Tadros, Director of the Coalition for Religious Equality and Inclusive Development. And she will be speaking on the key policy message for redressing religious inequalities for people with disabilities. This is such an important issue, and we know that we have signed up across the United Kingdom. Government has signed up to the global goals. And one of those very key goals is that no one should be left behind. And I think it is just so important to recognise that many people with disabilities continue to be left behind in so many ways across the world. And having that double difficulty in a sense of discrimination that people can experience internationally of having their ability and potential fully recognised rather than people focused on disability aspects of their person. And alongside of that, the religious inequality that people can experience on top of that, almost a double discrimination in many areas of life. It's so important that we focus our Sustainable Development Goals efforts on the most vulnerable. And I know as a Member of Parliament, that's what people across the United Kingdom want us to focus our Global Goals effort on, supporting the most vulnerable across the international spectrum, including those with disabilities. So this is an important issue that we are discussing today. And enough from me, because I want to hand over now to the very important speakers that we have, who will bring information to us that we need as parliamentarians to take these issues forward. We'll have our presentation round about 11:35. Then Jim Shannon will take over the chair from there, and we'll have a Q&A up to 11:55 and closing remarks from Jim. And so please put into the chat any information you need to put in regarding questions for the Q&A, issues you want to raise, ideas that you think parliamentarians could take forward to really champion these issues. So welcome firstly to Bridget and Stephen, and over to you for your presentation.
Thank you very much, Lisa.
Thank you for the introduction. It's a pleasure to be here. So I'm going to start and introduce our study, which we undertook in Chennai in India, around freedom of religious belief and people with disabilities. And then Brigitte will continue. So in terms of a bit of context, we selected India for the focus of our study because of its unique history and current situation. With regards to religion in India, the majority of the population are Hindu, about 80%, and the remaining 20% are made up of various religions, and Islam is the largest of the minority religion with about 14% of the population. The statistics around disability prevalence in India are somewhat patchy. The official prevalence rate is 2.2%, but we know that this is perhaps a little bit low compared to other international comparisons. In years to come, really, hopefully the statistics around disability prevalence will improve in India, so we have a better idea of what's going on. The methodology for the study, I'm not going to go into too much detail, but please do have a look in the paper where there's more detail on how we undertook this study. But we did a qualitative study, and one of the techniques we used was narrative interviews. And we thought this was important because we very much wanted to bring the voice of the participants to the fore. And this is particularly important for people who are traditionally marginalised. So we really wanted to make sure that we captured their voice as detailedly as we could. So we interviewed, we worked very closely with a local researcher, and we interviewed 15 participants who were Muslim and Christian. They had a range of impairments. There was a mixture of women and men, and they were also from a range of different castes. Now, when we undertook the study, it was during the COVID-19 pandemic, so we had to adjust our approach slightly. Some of the interviews were done remotely, either by Zoom or Skype, and we've done other work at IDS showing how this is an appropriate way to proceed when you can't do interviews face to face. And again, please do have a look at the website for more details on some of that other work. And important to say as well, when we were undertaking the study, we made sure reasonable accommodation was provided so that everyone could participate in a way that was comfortable for them, and no one was excluded on grounds of their needs. So in terms of the findings, unfortunately, we found discrimination based on a number of factors, including faith, disability, class, and gender, is still very much prevalent. And this played out across a number of different areas of people's lives. So, for example, with regards to employment, quite often people were discriminated and in some cases experienced multiple discrimination. So, for example, access to jobs was denied to some people. So if you are from a minority religion, you may find it harder to find work. But it also meant that some people actually hid or concealed their religion because they were worried that they wouldn't get work or that they may miss out on other benefits. So this is something that's actually quite concerning, that people felt they weren't free to practice the religion in the way that they wanted to, because they felt they may miss out on either work or benefits. And there was also discrimination both from an implicit and an explicit way, and in some cases people's disability was used as a reason to not promote them, but some participants felt that this may have been used to hide other forms of discrimination based around their faith. So in broader society, there was also displays of discrimination, and particularly concerning was around access to education, and girls in particular fell or experienced some of this discrimination, either around their religion or their disability or their caste. And then for those who managed to get into school, many of them were bullied or experienced very negative treatment when in school, again, on a range of these factors, or in some cases because of several of the factors overlapping. and just various different aspects of society. So even moving around public transport, it's quite often inaccessible. So people with disabilities found it hard to use, but also people from minority religions were perhaps singled out for negative treatment because of the way they dressed or because of various aspects which made them identifiable as religious minorities. And very worryingly, some of the participants experienced violence as a result of belonging to religious minorities. And this was either violence with regards to their person or religious buildings that they held sacred. And there was a particular concern there around people from the majority religion feeling like people from the minority religions were trying to convert them. And this seemed to be the root of some of the very negative treatment. And then people from minority religions who were traders or who had shops, in some cases were targeted by thugs who undertook violence and threatening behaviour in order to disrupt their livelihoods. And that was very much seen to be based on the religion of those traders. So I'll just pass over to Brigitte. Brigitte, if you're there.
Yes, so turning to people's experiences within their own families. So their experiences of discrimination and inclusion tended to be in relation to participants' disability rather than their religious affiliation, except for in instances where they'd converted. So some of the people with disabilities that we interviewed have had traumatic experiences of abuse and abandonment from some of their family members. This included instances of being tied up, being forced into exploitative child labor situations, being abandoned at an orphanage by their mother. Some participants said their lives had been restricted and that they'd been confined to their homes or removed from education by their families' overprotectiveness in relation to their disability. Some families worried or reacted negatively when the people we interviewed converted or suggested that they want to convert, especially those from Hinduism to another religion. So some people kept it secret. And such conversions were often related to the acceptance of their disability, which they felt from particular religious leaders or community members. And then turning to people's experiences within their faith communities. So this was mixed for people from, due to their disability and their caste. So people with disabilities have been discriminated against and excluded from their own faith communities. This included lack of reasonable accommodation, which makes it hard for them to participate in religious life, as well as direct discrimination on the basis of disability. In some cases, previous exclusion and difficulties have resulted in self-exclusion from the social life of their community because they felt like they were a burden or they wanted to avoid the negative comments of others. And in some cases, this disability discrimination was accompanied by gender or caste discrimination. And examples are provided of all this in the paper. And there were also cases of participants who were discriminated against on the basis of their disability within their own faith community, but they mentioned feeling welcomed by other faith communities or other denominations, especially when it came to their experiences of schools for people with disabilities run by different religious bodies. Looking now at some of the benefits of social inclusion and assistance, specifically for different groups which people experienced. So participants told of how their lives were improved when they were included in education, in religious and social life, and in employment. So as well as experienced exclusion from their family, other participants gave examples of how their family or their friends fought to get them a school place, for example, took them to the religious services, helped them start a business, or helped them to find a partner. And some had positive experiences of inclusion in school, both because of their disability or because of their religion. For example, there was a Muslim participant who attended a Bible college for people with disabilities, who described how the college provided special facilities to help them keep up with other students, and also helped them to practice their religion by buying them a Quran with much bigger printed letters. A few participants spoke of religious leaders or communities and provided them with practical support, who helped them accept their disability and who gave them a sense of worth. The government also has some skills and job programs in place which benefit people with disabilities, as well as having some programs for Dalits. And such inclusion helped people with disabilities from minority religious groups feel accepted and increase their confidence. It helped to strengthen community ties, and it led to people with disabilities realizing their potential. Turning finally to policy recommendations. Development, policy, and practice should recognize that people have multiple identities and that these can sometimes exacerbate exclusion, marginalization, and vulnerability. States must adhere to the international human rights frameworks that they have committed to, including the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which both protect freedom of religious belief and the rights of people with disabilities. Non-state actors, such as businesses, religious bodies, or private organizations, should not wait for state adherence to these human rights frameworks to fulfill these principles within their own practice. Interventions targeting one factor of people with disabilities, for example, being a woman or having disabilities, should consider the potential impact of other identity factors, such as religious affiliation or caste. Otherwise, there's a risk that the effectiveness of the intervention is negated by the discrimination against other aspects of a person's identity. And as mentioned, people sometimes can keep their identities private or secret, making it harder to identify and potentially target disadvantaged groups. It should be recognized that exclusion and marginalization can be experienced from within the community, and it should not be assumed that discrimination against a wider group, such as members of a minority faith group, necessarily creates solidarity and inclusive practices within that group. And action is needed to ensure that all religious activities become inclusive. Reasonable accommodation must be provided to ensure that people with disabilities have the ability and freedom to participate in religion and to practice their chosen religious faith. Thank you.
Thank you so much. What a wonderful presentation and excellent work that has gone into finding out people's actual experiences across a multitude of different protected characteristics that can impact upon discrimination, including, gender as well, and age, etc. That's coming into the mix there. And there's some good questions already in the chat, so please remember to add your questions to the chat. We'll be moving over swiftly to Dilmurad Yusupov, who is a PhD candidate and will be speaking about disability, ethnic and religious inequalities in post-Soviet Uzbekistan. Dilmurad.
Thank you very much, Lisa. I'm just sharing my slides.
Thank you.
Can you see my slides? Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you very much for having me today, and I'm really pleased to talk about my recently published working paper about deaf Uzbek Jehovah's Witnesses. It is the case of how disability, ethnic and religious identities may result in exacerbation of marginalization of persons with disabilities in a very unique context like Uzbekistan, which is a post-Soviet country located in Central Asia. I briefly talk about Uzbekistan in its religious context. Uzbekistan was part of the Soviet Union until 1991, and you may know that Soviet Union, there was only one religion, which was communism, and the government the Soviet government promoted the so-called state atheism, and there were so many restrictions on the freedom of religion or belief, including practice of Islam and other religions. But after the country gained its independence in 1991, there was a constitution adopted which proclaimed Uzbekistan as a secular state and provided freedom of conscience. And nowadays, based on some available statistics, a majority of the population in Uzbekistan is Muslim, of Sunni Muslim, and there are Eastern Orthodox groups for about 9%, and other religions represented for about 3%. Interestingly, there is less than 2% of registered persons with disabilities out of 34 million population, which is very underestimated, I think, because the general prevalence of disability worldwide is about 15%. And I personally don't believe in the statistics. And as Stephen was saying about disability prevalence in India, we need to make a lot of research about it in Uzbekistan as well. Interestingly, despite the fact
Oh, I seem to have lost the sound.
and discourses.
Oh, there we are.
Sorry, my connection may not be stable, I think.
Oh, we have you loud and clear again now, so.
Okay, sorry.
Let's hope that's it rectified.
Thank you. I hope it will be fine. Despite the fact that Uzbekistan proclaimed itself as a secular state, there are some interesting interpretations and discourses on freedom of religion or belief, which are shaped informally, like by the majority Muslim community. And there is, if you look at this diagram, Uzbek and Muslim, there is an ethno-religious identification, so that Uzbek ethnic people are self-identified as Muslims by birth, or like they are per se, they are recognized as Muslims. So if you're born Uzbek, that it means that you are Uzbek, so you can't choose any other religion than Islam. And in this context, there is a specific group of Christian denomination, which is called Jehovah's Witnesses. And they have been present in Uzbekistan for a long time, even during the Soviet times. And currently they estimate for 4,000 followers across Uzbekistan. Despite these number of followers, there is only one registered organization in Chirchik, which is a city in Tashkent region. You can see this on the photo, their banner, which says the Kingdom of Whole, which was allowed only by authorities only 2 years ago. And there are many formal and informal barriers to registration of Jehovah's Witnesses across Uzbekistan, because they want to register their churches in other parts of the country. There is a widespread persecution, which has stopped considerably after the recent political changes in Uzbekistan. But still they are being prosecuted, particularly ethnic Uzbeks who converted to Jehovah's Witnesses, because they were considered as Muslims by birth, but now they're converted to Jehovah's Witnesses. So there is kind of oppression and discrimination of Uzbek ethnic groups based on their new religious identification. There are conflicts and tensions at the community, family level, and society level. And if we introduce, I did research with deaf and hard of hearing people in Uzbekistan, which was part of my PhD. I didn't expect that I would delve into this theme, and it was very unexpected, because I realized that many deaf people in the community of the deaf people were converted. They converted to the Jehovah's Witnesses because many mosques were not accessible to them. No sign language interpretation was not accessible, and these led to exacerbation of their marginalization. and social exclusion. If we look at the statistics of deaf people, again, the prevalence of deaf and hard of hearing people is very unclear. And there is only one available data which says that more than 20,000 people registered with the Society of the Deaf, which is the main organization in Uzbekistan uniting deaf people. There is a deprived access to quality education and sign language. And the sign language was prohibited for a long time at schools. There are many barriers for communication, and the status of the Uzbek Sign Language, which is similar to Russian Sign Language, is very unclear. And autism is prevalent. Autism is a discrimination on the basis of hearing impairment. There is high unemployment rate and fragmented deaf community. And in this context, I found that those who were converted to Jehovah's Witnesses, deaf people, they were framed by the dominant religious community, the Muslim community, as those lost in the world of silence, those who are not able to make their decision on their own regarding religion. So the Jehovah's Witnesses were framed as missionary work, they were as proselytism, and so basically deaf people Uzbek deaf Jehovah's Witnesses were considered as those lost without knowing a lot about Islam. So the idea of this community was to bring them back to Islam, rather than including them as they are, so denying their freedom of religion. This resulted in the split in the deaf community. And there were many tensions and conflicts at the household level. And because Islam is a very important in including people within the communities, the Muslim communities, deaf people who converted to Jehovah's Witnesses, they were excluded even by the deaf community. But on the other hand, there was one positive impact of this conversion, is that Islamic institutions, following the example of the Jehovah's Witnesses, they made their sermons accessible. And for the first time in Uzbekistan, the first sermon, the Friday sermon at a local mosque in Tashkent was interpreted in sign language. This was done because in the deaf people, they became a field of contestation between majority religious group and the minority religious group. And this competition led to a provision of accessibility for deaf and hard of hearing people. So this was one of the positive impacts.
A minute left, if that's okay.
Yeah, that's okay. Yeah. Thank you. Regarding the policy recommendations, I would say that based on my findings, we need to increase sensitivity at the policy level to religious inequalities within the disability and development programs. Because many times when we do disability projects, where we usually forget about religious inequalities, we need also to give special attention to the field of disability studies and development studies, because I think freedom of religion or belief, religious inequalities are not very much researched within the area of disability studies. I also think we need to strengthen legal capacities of minority religious groups to exercise their constitutional rights to freedom of conscience by providing them with accessible legal education and raising awareness of dominant religious groups about freedom of religion and belief. And finally, as the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities also provides for, in its preamble, it provides for recognition of multiple discrimination based on the religion, disability, any gender. I think we need to also promote ratification and implementation of the CRPD in low and middle income countries. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much. What a wonderful presentation and research that you've been undertaking. Our final speaker is Professor Mariz Tadros, who will be speaking on religious inequalities for people with disability. And following from Professor Tadros's presentation, Jim Shannon will be taking over the chair. So over to yourself, Professor Tadros. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Lisa Cameron and Mr. Jim Shannon, for kindly co-chairing this event. We are very grateful for your presence with us, and very much like to thank you all on behalf of the Coalition for Religious Equality and Inclusive Development, which is a consortium that is convened by the Institute of Development Studies in collaboration with minority rights group El Hoi Foundation and RIFSEMI. And we work with 30 to 40 partners in 6 different countries. And the consortium aims to redress religious inequalities in how they are experienced by people in relation to multiple exclusions on the basis of class, gender, geographic location, and so forth. And just wanted to start with a question of why India and Uzbekistan, of all places, why these in particular? And I want to tell the story of how we as a coalition began to explore questions of disability in relation to religious inequalities or freedom of religion or belief. So one of the aims of the consortium was that we would de-ghettoize freedom of religion or belief, which basically means that we wanted people to think about religious equalities and inequalities in relation to any context where there is religious diversity, but this diversity isn't being celebrated to the full, and people are being discriminated against on the basis of multiple identities. And we thought we would start with the Institute of Development Studies, and we asked colleagues to propose from the existing areas of work that they are leading on, areas where they would like to look at religious inequalities as another interpretive lens with which they look at their existing work. And of course, I'm very, very grateful to Stephen and Brigitte, who have been working for a mighty long time on issues to do with the inclusion of people with disabilities. And they suggested, how about we look at that interface between disabilities and religious inequalities? And then, of course, Dilmurad had completed his empirical work for his doctorate degree looking at issues of inclusivity in Uzbekistan, and proposed that he also reflect on his empirical experiences with that interpretive lens in mind. But it is interesting that in that process, we discovered that we ourselves, as we look at our own understanding of inclusivity, we need to be mindful of the extent to which, in our championing of freedom of religion or belief, the extent to which we as a program are inclusive ourselves. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank also, in addition to Brigitte and Stephen and Dilmurad, colleagues at IDS, in particular Sophie, Kat, Gary, and Emily, and Sue and James, but also to thank colleagues at the APG on disability, in particular Roberta, and colleagues at the APG on freedom of religion and belief, Amro and Nancy, and to say that a special thank you to Marco Nadi for coming in last minute to provide us with sign language interpretation. And for that, I owe a great deal to our comms lead for the program, Emily Wilson, who said, surely if we are looking at issues of freedom of religion or belief and disability, we need to start with our own program. And this is the first time ever that we are having a public event where we are providing sign language interpretation, thanks to Marco joining us at very last minute. It made us think. We have looked at inequalities in relation to class, to gender, to geographic location, to ethnicity. We haven't actually, until this moment, truly brought in that interface with disability in our program until this research was taken forward and Emily brought this to our attention. And I think this is the very first policy brief. that we need to start looking at our own practices organizationally and thinking, to what extent are we truly being enabling to all? To what extent are we truly being inclusive to all when we talk about inclusion? And CREED is now committed that for every single new public event we hold, we would want to have sign language interpretation, and we would like to have captions, and we would like to purposefully take into consideration what measures do we need to put in place to make sure that we are being inclusive. And that, I think, may be something as a policy recommendation to all organizations championing freedom of religion or belief, to all initiatives championing freedom of religion or belief and religious equality, to start with making that space, those policies inclusive of people with various disabilities. That's the first policy recommendation. How do we do it organizationally? How do we all walk the inclusive talk that we so believe in? The second policy recommendation is that we need to be truly purposeful in how we do our own research and our own outreach work. But when promoting gender inclusivity, freedom of religion or belief, the inclusion of poor people and so forth, is how do we also take into account people where there is that intersection of having a disability with various other forms of marginality. And just to say that we need to sort of look at our own program now and think about when we do our own outreach work, are we inclusive of people with disabilities? In our own research, do we have the voices of people with disabilities also contributing? Because like Stephen and Khakita and Dilmurad pointed out, even though these are areas where there are sometimes double and triple and quadruple forms of discrimination, people with disabilities also have a great deal to contribute to society and to our own understanding of freedom of religion and belief, as well as all the other identity intersections. So just to give you a very small anecdote, and this is not, we cannot generalize from this anecdote. I think it just shows us why there's a need for more purposeful research. In Egypt, we have been working with young people of a Coptic Egyptian heritage, enabling them to document their cultural heritage that is under threat. And interestingly, we were collecting stories about, the young people were collecting stories within their communities in Egypt about the cultural heritage that is widely prevalent among Copts of having a cross not imprinted, it's almost, well, it is, it's a Coptic tattoo of a cross on the wrist, which they've been doing for centuries, well before tattoos became fashionable in the West. And in one of these interviews, one of the young people that was being interviewed who had a disability applied for one of the positions that is available for people with disabilities, because Egypt has a quota that all employers must employ a certain percentage of the workforce of people with disabilities. And he said that this was at a local level. He said that the person who was interviewing him saw the tattoo of a cross and said to him, "Go wipe that off and come back again and apply for the position." So again, we stumbled upon this. We were not purposely seeking to capture the experiences of people with disabilities. And now I think because of the evidence that has been gathered from India and Uzbekistan, it's making us think in the context in which we work, Egypt, Pakistan, Iraq, and so forth, and other contexts in which we work as a program, do we need to be more purposeful about being multi-vocal, but also thinking about our outreach? So that is the second policy recommendation. And the third policy recommendation, and I'm closing here, has to do with the whole idea of dialogues, of bringing people into dialogue with each other. Because just like we as a program that has been championing bringing in the rights of people who are marginalized on account of being affiliated or associated with a faith, and also experiencing socioeconomic exclusion, other forms of exclusion. And we have been, as a program, the work of Minority Rights Group and REFSEMI and ILHOI and IDS collectively, that we have been seeking to bring that agenda into the mainstream, get anyone who is working in a pluralistic context to think about this. The same thing has also been happening with people who have been and initiatives championing the rights of people with disability. They have also sought to de-ghettoize this so that it would become normalized in development policy and practice, in all policies that aim to make societies and politics inclusive. And when we are talking about de-ghettoizing disability and de-ghettoizing freedom of religion or belief, it's bringing them into dialogue with each other that I think is also a starting point for all of us in order to make our societies and politics, whether nationally or globally, more inclusive. So how, I think we see today's event as the beginning of a dialogue of bringing forth the evidence, of bringing forth the mindful policies, of revealing where our blind spots are, and also starting with ourselves as programs. So I think this is the beginning of our conversation, and we need you all, and we thank you all. We thank all the participants and those that have joined us for prioritizing your time this morning to come into dialogue with us. But we certainly need you to accompany us along the rest of our journey in how do we purposefully become more inclusive, so that everyone is part of our thinking when we think about inclusion. Thank you very, very much. And over now to Jim.
I'm presuming that I'm probably now going to chair it. Is that correct? And if so, if we,
Jim, we're delighted that you're here.
Yeah, I was waiting to see. I wasn't sure if you were still there or if you were away to Scottish questions. But if you're happy for me to take over, I presume I'm doing this at 12 o'clock at 12 noon. Is that right, Lisa? Please.
Yeah, that's correct.
Okay.
There's already some questions there in the chat, Jim. So
Right.
that will probably take us up to 12. Yeah.
Okay. So if you have any questions then from anyone, please just tell us your name and give us your question, please. And I'm not quite sure if we have any questions at the moment on my screen anyway, but I presume that those in charge in the background will be able to keep me right. Do we have any questions?
I think there's a question in the chat, Jim. How do people with disabilities perceive themselves in terms of abilities, rights and equalities? And there's also one about age discrimination alongside disability and religion, just from the chat I can see.
Yeah. Who would like to answer those questions? If you'd like to answer, put your hand up, please, and that'll be my way of knowing. I tell you what, while we go for the Brigitte, you're scratching your head there. Does that mean you're going to answer? Well done. Okay.
I think in terms of how people perceive themselves, I think just talking from the people that we were interviewing, it really depended on how their experiences of inclusion and exclusion. So the people who'd experienced like a lot of discrimination and negative attitudes within their own communities, they withdrew from activities because they were worried that they were a burden, and so on. Whereas the people who'd been included, they definitely felt like that there was more that they could do. And even people who'd been discriminated against, they definitely felt like we have something to contribute. Like one of them was a church leader, and they felt like I definitely can lead a church, and maybe you around me don't think that me as someone who's blind can do this, but I can do this. And there were other cases I think the more inclusion people have, the more people feel that they can achieve. And even with exclusion, people definitely feel like they have much more potential than the expectations of the people around them. I don't know if you've got anything to add, Stephen or Dilmurad.
Stephen, have you anything you'd like to add to those at all, please?
I think Brigitta's covered most of the points there. I would say, I think in some cases it's deeply personal how people view their identity, and that changes from person to person, and it may change over time as well. But I think Brigitta covered most of the main points there.
Okay. Any other comments from our last speaker, perhaps? Yes, Maurice, thank you. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Jim. No, I think we concur with Brigitta's lens on this. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Have we any other? I think we had another question, hadn't we? I think maybe as well. Please, if maybe just refresh your memories on that, but if someone could do that for me, please.
It was age discrimination, Jim, alongside gender and disability and religion. So that's one of the ones from the chat.
Okay. Will we start with you, Stephen, for a change of response, please? Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Yes, so for our study, so we had 15 participants and they were all adults, and we didn't interrogate the data based on age, but that would certainly be something that would be interesting, for studies going forward, and certainly incidents of disability and impairment tend to increase with age, so that would be something for future research to look at.
Okay. Maryse, maybe if you were available for a comment, please. Thank you.
I think this is the incredibly important questions that are being raised in the Q&A just show how little we know, that we're just scratching the surface about the intersection of disability with religious marginalization. And these are really important questions for us to take forward, both in the CREED program, think about how inclusive we are in our own practices, but also include in the research. So I'm afraid we still have that journey to come up with robust empirical material to answer these important questions on age and disability.
Okay, thank you. Brigitte, can we ask you again maybe to comment, please? Brigitte?
I also wanted, if I may.
Okay, sorry, excuse me. Yes, please, go ahead, apologies.
Yeah, thank you very much. There was a question, a really interesting question, is about the type of impairment, how discriminating is a factor compared to other issues as gender or religion. I found, because I did my ethnographic fieldwork mainly with persons with hearing impairments, I think impairment counts a lot, because deaf and hard of hearing people are very much underrepresented and are marginalized. So they were already marginalized because of the communication barriers, low quality of education, and deaf people, I believe, are more discriminated compared to other disability groups. And when it comes to the freedom of religion of belief, the capacity to choose religion or faith or any belief, they are denied this capacity, citing that they are not able to make a choice because they are not religiously educated. They don't have secular education. So lack of education attainment is judged as a lack of capacity to choose any religion. This is an important point, I think, here. And for example, I compared deaf people to blind and visually impaired people, and blind people are more vocal, they are more literate, educated, and they can defend their right for freedom of religion, for the freedom of conscience. But when it comes to deaf people, there are many questions raised about their legal and in usual daily capacity to choose their faith. So yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, Brigitte, if you want to, please, thank you.
Sure. There was a question which was asking about how big a discriminating factor disability was in comparison to the other factors like gender, caste, religion, and so on. And just in terms of the people that we interviewed, I think disability definitely was one of the biggest factors because it had such a big impact in their family life, within their religious communities, in their education, in their work. And that was where they had faced more discrimination, also because in some ways, their religious identity, they were spending more time within their own religious community, so it wasn't as oppositional as perhaps their disability identity was, and there was a lot more exclusion they experienced when they were talking about their lives in relation to their disability than to other identity factors, although those other identity factors also played a role in the exclusionary experiences they had.
Okay, thank you very much. Thanks for those very comprehensive answers as well. Have we any other questions on chat at all, Lisa, or anyone in there, please? Sorry.
Oh, sorry, Jim. I think there's one that I can see which is about physical disability as opposed to intellectual disability or learning disability. And
yeah, I think we had the Murad. Maybe do you want to go back on that one, and then Stephen after that, please? Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I just wanted to touch upon the question on the prohibition of sign language in Uzbekistan, because this was really interesting question. Maybe Mako will also understand this. There is a specific belief that sign language is not a language. It's just signs, and it's not recognized as a language, which is very not true. It's a cultural identification. It's a language of deaf and hard of hearing people. And there is a specific understanding in Uzbekistan that deaf and hard of hearing children should be taught how to speak. So even if they are deaf, they need to learn how to speak and to. So this is called autism, or like discrimination on the basis of hearing impairment. So the problem is found within the body of deaf children, their hearing impairment, rather than in the society. The society is not providing accommodation, sign language interpretation services. It's not developing, it's not recognizing sign language as a legal, it's not providing a legal status to the sign language. And this makes deaf people to be adapted to the society rather than society being adapted to deaf people. And therefore they were denied using sign language at schools, but rather they were forced to vocalize, to provide sounds, which is very discriminatory towards persons with hearing impairments. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Stephen, on that same question, please.
So while we tried to get a range of people with different impairments in the study, we did recognise that it is at times quite hard to make sure that everyone's represented. And in particular, people with intellectual impairments or complex or multiple impairments are quite often left out of research. So we would urge researchers to make an extra effort to try and include impairments which are perhaps more marginalised, or people with impairments which are more marginalised, to be included in studies wherever possible. Okay, Stephen, thank you. Maryse, please.
I think this is one of the really important takeaways, building on what Dilmurad and Stephen Fligita said, is that when we started our work on the CREED program, we recognized very quickly that not all people who are marginalized on the basis of their faith experience inequalities and discrimination similarly. The experience of Ahmadiyyas is different from the Shia Hazaras, is from the Christian Dalits, from the Hindu Dalits, for example, in the context of Pakistan. And we recognize that we need to look at that intersection of where are they living, how does it intersect with us, what are their experiences, and so forth. And one of the takeaways from this is this also applies in not homogenizing and treating people with disabilities as a monolith. We also need to be very nuanced in what is the broad spectrum in which people experience disabilities. And to be mindful, just like was said, that sometimes we can include some more easily than others, or we are mindful or aware of some kinds of disabilities more than others. And for example, when I was just reflecting on our experience of working with Coptic young people in Egypt, I could say, yes, out of the 100 or so, we do have people who have physical impairments on the program collecting their heritage. But other kinds of disabilities that are of a mental kind, for example, I would not be aware, and I wonder whether the coordinators who are leading the program in Egypt are themselves aware. And this is where this issue of also being aware of the differences and the spectrum and being sensitive to that needs to be brought in, both in terms of our research, but also any outreach programs.
Okay, thank you. Brigitte, please.
I just wanted to add to that, like, in terms of the way in which you do research, participatory methods, which were used for this and which were used for some other research looking at people with disabilities' experience of COVID, which also included people with intellectual disabilities, and that is really a way of forefronting their voice and properly listening to them and being properly listened to. As someone asked in the questions, what's a way to empower people? That is one of the ways to do that. And I think there's a link in the chat to a blog which talked about different ways in which you can do disability inclusive remote research, which is necessary during these times, in a way that's a bit more participatory and so on.
Okay, thanks so much. Lisa, have we any other questions that are outstanding at all, please?
I'm not seeing any, Jim.
Right.
No, I think that's comprehensive.
That certainly is. Can I then perhaps maybe conclude the process, first of all, by thanking you, Lisa, as the chair, for your interest in the subject matter and for bringing the two matters together of disability and addressing the issue of religious inequality in particular, which I have a deep interest in. I know you have as well. To our four speakers, to Stephen Thompson, to Delmarad Yusupov, I hope that's correctly pronounced, Mariz Tadros, and Brigitte Roverda, I think would be I'm sure with my Northern Ireland accent, it probably doesn't sound anything like it should be, but that's by the way. Can I thank our sign language interpreter as well, who has been very physically active, and we really appreciate that contribution that you have made. And I think maybe it probably underlines the matter of disability and how you're doing that. But thank you so much for that. I want to make some closing remarks, if I can, please, by obviously thanking all of our speakers from the Institute of Development Studies and the Coalition for Religious Equality and Inclusive Development for their insightful contributions, not only to their contributions, but also to their answers to the questions. As Lisa has referred to, the answers have been very, very detailed and have addressed the issues as well, but they've also left us with some ideas for the future. People with disabilities have a key role to play in society. I subscribe to that, as does Lisa, and as do all the speakers, and as does this House of Commons as well. We need to be mindful of those impediments that hinder their full participation. As we've been hearing today, people with disabilities may experience exclusion not only due to their physical environment, but also subject, very clearly, as our speakers have said, to social and economic marginalisation. We've also heard how this discrimination may be exacerbated even further if they identify as members of a religious minority, compounding the exclusion or even the persecution they face. I think it was Marie's, in fact, give the example of a person who had a cross in their hand. This social and financial discrimination can lead to the erosion of people's rights and increase poverty as well. So as parliamentarians in this House and activists as we all are, we should champion their rights and work with those doubly impacted by such discrimination to ensure that they are sufficiently represented and that their unique needs are considered. Over 1 billion people around the world live with some form of disability. That's an enormous number of people. As 80% of the world also lives in areas where religious freedom is highly restricted, The two combination of both can only be illustrated through the questions and answers and contributions today. We can see that more than 1 in 10 people around the globe are living with the consequences of the double marginalisation. UK's government efforts to improve freedom of religion or belief and to redress religious inequalities need to take into account the needs of people with disabilities. I believe that's something that we as parliamentarians are doing, but what we also need to continue to do to bring it to the attention of government repetitively and often. Her Majesty's government should promote the rights of people with disabilities who belong to religious and belief minorities, both in its agenda for championing freedom of religion or belief globally, and also in its agenda for championing the rights of people with disabilities, interconnecting the issues to ensure a consistent and a systematic approach is taken. So again, I wish to thank you all for your contributions, for your questions, for your answers, to everyone that made this day happen, and thank you. And I wish you well. Keep safe, God bless, and take care. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
All right.